The reading of the will was set for 11 o'clock on the 14th of March, in the year 1817. In the blue drawing-room at Halkett House, and Nora Patten arrived 3 minutes before the hour because she did not know how else to face what was coming than to be early. She stood near the window where the light fell coldest, wearing the good gray wool she kept for Sundays and funerals, her hands clasped in front of her at the level of her waist. She was aware of her hands as she never was aware of them on ordinary mornings, aware of the roughness at the knuckles and the ink stain she had not entirely managed to scrub away from her left forefinger. Around her the drawing-room, filled with the people who belonged in it. Mr. Hale, the old Duke's solicitor, arranged his papers at the escritoire, with the careful economy of a man who had presided over many such mornings. Lady Constance Fellows arrived in black silk that spoke less of mourning than of authority, her daughter Georgiana at her elbow, and took the largest chair, without waiting to be invited to it. 3 of the old Duke's distant male cousins settled near the door, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Satt. Bird stood apart against the wall with the expressionlessness of a woman who has worked for this family long enough to have learned the art of witnessing without appearing to watch. Edmund Claverfield, the Earl of Halkett, arrived last. He entered without announcement, and Nora felt his arrival before she saw it, felt the quality of air in the room alter the way air alters before weather changes. He was tall and spare and dark, and he moved with the kind of economy that belongs to men who have learned to contain themselves in rooms that required it. He had been at his Dorset estate when the old Duke died. He had returned in under 48 hours. He had not, in the 2 days since his arrival, spoken a single direct word to her, and she had not expected that he would. Mr. Hale cleared his throat. What he read in the first paragraphs was ordinary enough. The entail, the unencumbered lands, the London house, the contents of Halkett's library and picture gallery, the annuities to long-serving members of the household. The room breathed normally through all of it. Lady Constance's chin tipped slightly upward as each clause was delivered, the posture of a woman waiting for her name. Then Mr. Hale reached the penultimate codicil. He read it twice. The first time because that was procedure. The second time because the room had ceased to function as a room that could receive meaning. The old Duke, Aldous Claverfield, 5th Duke of Halkett, had left the entirety of his personal fortune, the sum of some £11,000, together with the contents of his private accounts and the unentailed property at Wrentham, to Miss Eleanor Patten, formerly of service at Halkett House, in recognition of her fidelity and her companionship in his last years. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "The boot girl," Lady Constance said, in a voice so flat it could have been used to press linen. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It did not need to be. The 3 distant cousins looked at each other. Georgiana Fellows pressed her lips together with the deliberate composure of a young woman who has been told since childhood that composure is the correct response to the wrong kind of surprise. Mrs. Dearson. Bird against the wall became slightly more expressionless. He looked at her. He had inherited the earldom and everything entailed with it. He had not inherited £11,000. He looked at Nora with an expression she could not name, something between the careful stillness of a man who is regrouping and the careful stillness of a man who is, against all propriety, not surprised, and her pulse moved in a way she could not afford to examine. She looked back at the window, outside. The March light was doing nothing in particular. It was not the kind of morning that dramatized itself. It would be, Nora understood, the only thing anyone talked about for the remainder of the season. She had come to Halkett House at the age of 17, the daughter of a clergyman whose parish had dissolved along with his health in the same year, leaving her with an education that had not prepared her for commerce and hands that had not yet learned what they were capable of. She had been engaged as a general domestic, which was a gentle way of saying she was assigned whatever the better-positioned servants preferred not to be assigned. She blacked the boots, she carried coals. She scrubbed the kitchen flags when the scullery girl fell ill. She did not complain about any of it, not because she had no opinion of it, but because she had read enough of the world already to understand that complaint would not return her father to life or restore the parish living. And so she kept her opinions in a particular interior drawer, and went about her work with the kind of steadiness that either goes unnoticed or becomes with time indispensable. The old Duke had noticed. Aldous Claverfield, 5th Duke of Halcott, had been 81 when Nora arrived, and the household had been treating him as though he had already died for at least a decade. His daughters from his first marriage called once a month and spoke loudly and slowly, as though age had thickened his ears. His male relations sent letters that were really inquiries about the entail. His valet, who was loyal and competent, was also very busy with the matters of running the great house, and could not always spare the quarter hours the old Duke wanted for someone to sit with while he talked. The old Duke talked a great deal. He had been to the continent twice, and India. Once had served in a minor capacity during the American War, had known 3 kings, and disliked 2 of them, and had opinions about the nature of courage that were both more nuanced and more earned than the opinions of men who had never been frightened. Nora had started staying after she brought the morning coal. It had not been a plan. The old man had been in the middle of a story about Lisbon in 1789, and she had set down the coal scuttle and listened, because the story was genuinely interesting and because no one else in the house seemed to understand that yet. He had noticed her listening. She had brought the coal the next morning and stayed again. By the end of the first month it was an unspoken arrangement, and by the end of the first year it was something that Nora would have had difficulty explaining in terms that the rest of the household would have considered creditable. She did not think of herself as his companion. She thought of herself as a person who had been given access to a very good library by a very unusual circumstance, and she was sensible enough not to waste it. She had read to him when his eyes worsened. She had written letters at his dictation to the Poor Box Committee of the village church because he believed that £4 a quarter was both insufficient and anonymous, and he did not wish to be thanked for charity. She had argued with him about the proper spelling of certain Latin quotations and had sometimes been right. He had given her, on the occasion of her 21st birthday, a small pocket almanac bound in dark green leather, with his initials stamped in the lower corner, because she had admired it when he showed it to her once and then never mentioned it again, in the manner of a person too well bred to hint. She carried it in her apron pocket. She carried it. Still, he arrived at Halcott officially on the 15th of March, having spent the night of the 14th in the village inn, rather than return to the house while legal matters were still unsettled. Nora watched his carriage come up the drive from the upper landing window. She had not been avoiding that window. She simply happened to be passing. He summoned her to the library that same afternoon. End quote. She went because refusing to go was not something she had available to her, and because in any case she did not entirely want to refuse. She told herself she did not want to refuse because she had done nothing wrong, and there was a certain dignity in facing what was coming. This was accurate. It was not the complete account of her reasons. She understood that it was not the complete account, and she set that understanding back in the interior drawer and closed it. He was standing at the window when she entered. He turned, and for a moment there was no particular expression on his face, just the presence of a man taking the inventory of a room in which he was not sure yet of the correct arrangement of things. "Miss Patten," he said. His voice was low, and he spoke without ornament. "My lord," she said. "I will not question the will," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever my private opinion of its composition, my great-uncle's wishes are his to have had, and I do not intend to spend the rest of the year in a solicitor's office arguing with a dead man." Nora had prepared several responses to several versions of this conversation on her walk down the corridor. None of them were available to her at this particular moment. "Lady Constance will argue it," she said, because it was true and seemed relevant. "Lady Constance argues with weather," he said. "Sit down, Miss Patten." She sat. He remained standing, which should have felt like dominance, and instead felt obscurely like the behavior of a man who was not certain what he would do with his hands if he sat. "You cannot leave Halcott until the probate is resolved," he said. "Mr. Hale has explained the timeline. It may be several months. I am told my uncle wished you to remain in the house during that interval." "I have no reason to countermand that. You have 11,000 reasons," Nora said, and then immediately regretted saying it, because it was the kind of precision her father had always said would get her into difficulty. Something moved in his face. She was not certain what it was. It was very brief, and it was gone before she could read it properly. "I have a house to put in order," he said, "and I understand you are the person in it who most knows where things are. That is sufficient reason for the present. Stay until the matter is settled." He was issuing a command that was also, if she chose to read it as such, a form of shelter. She chose, provisionally, to read it as such. If you have wondered how a woman in service comes to be seen by a man who has every institutional reason to look past her, stay with this story. It is a question that answers itself only slowly. He had been at Halcott twice since his majority, both times for brief visits that had the quality of obligation rather than sentiment. He had his Dorset estate, which required him, and a small property in Shropshire, and the business of the earldom, which was considerable. He had not had, as far as Nora could discern, much use for Halcott House, with its 26 rooms and its damp east wing, and the particular smell of old fires that never quite left the drawing-room curtains. He went through the house in the mornings as a man goes through an inherited language, with the diligence of someone who understands that fluency is required, but who does not yet possess it naturally. She sometimes encountered him in the library, or the east corridor, or the kitchen garden, where he would be conferring with one of the senior staff about window frames or the blocked drain by the orangery. And he would nod when he saw her, and she would nod, and they would both continue. The nods had a grammar to them that she did not entirely understand. It was in the kitchen garden, on the 4th day of his residence, that she first had cause to notice how he moved when he did not know he was being watched. He was examining a section of the garden wall that had begun to lose its pointing, and the old Duke's 3 dogs, who had been assigned to no one's particular care since the Duke's death, had followed Edmund out and were arranged around his feet in the hopeful dandy, patient manner of dogs who had decided provisionally that this was the person they were going to trust, and were waiting to see if the trust would prove warranted. He was not paying attention to them. He was looking at the wall, and then he glanced down, and Nora watched him look at the 3 dogs for a moment with an expression she had not yet seen on his face, something careful and a little worn, the expression of a man who was remembering something he had decided not to remember. And then he crouched down and ran his hand over the oldest dog's ears with a gentleness that did not match anything else in his public inventory. She was on the far side of the garden, and he did not see her. She stood where she was for a moment, longer than was necessary. The light in the kitchen garden that afternoon was the particular pale gold of early spring, the kind that does not commit itself, and the old Duke's dogs were still arranged around him, the youngest one pressing its nose into his palm. He let it. He was not performing gentleness for any audience. He simply had it, in the way some people have things they have never been told to have, and the having of it was so unguarded and so at odds with the careful economy he showed the world that she felt, obscurely, as though she had been given access to something she had not asked for and did not know how to return. She went back inside, put the almanac in her apron pocket where she could feel its weight, and she thought about the expression on his face. And she thought about how a person learns to manage the temperature of their own interior when they have been managing it for a long time, and then one thing happens to make it briefly, irrationally difficult. The library became their place without either of them choosing to make it so. It happened the way the morning coal sessions with the old Duke had happened, by increments too small to constitute a decision, until the pattern was established, and it was too late to call it nothing. She went to the library in the evenings because she had always gone there, because the old Duke had given her access to it years ago, and she had never entirely relinquished that access, and Edmund was there on 3 occasions in the first week and then, on most occasions thereafter. They were not always in conversation. More often they were both reading. But there were evenings when the reading gave way to something else, when one of them would put the book down and say something about the passage they had been in, and the other would respond, and the conversation would go where it wanted to go without asking either of them for permission. On a Thursday evening, in the 3rd week of March, she found him holding the old Duke's almanac. She had set it on the small reading table when she came in, meaning to return it to the shelf, and he had picked it up before she arrived to find him there, and was turning it in his hands with the particular attention of someone reading an object rather than a text. This was his, Edmund said. He gave it to me, Nora said. He set it down. He did not argue with her. He looked at it for a moment with the expression she had begun to catalogue internally, the one she could not name precisely, and then he said, "He was a better man than most people knew." "I know," she said. There was a silence of the particular variety that has weight in it, and in that silence he said, "My mother was a lady's companion here, at Halcott, before she married my father." He paused. "When my father died, she had very little, and the family did not choose to supplement that. She was no longer their concern. I was 12. I understood what I understood at 12, which is to say, I understood that a person's worth, in the machinery of this world, is often not the same as the world's account of her worth." He stopped. His voice had been entirely level, which was more informative than it would have been if it had been otherwise. My great-uncle was not responsible for that. He was abroad at the time, and he made provision for her when he understood what had happened, though the provision came late, and she did not live long enough to benefit substantially from it. I do not believe he forgot that. I do not believe he was without understanding of what it means to be considered of secondary consequence. Nora sat very still. The fire was low. The books around them held the silence in the manner of books, which are very good at silence. "He mentioned you," Edmund said. "In his letters to me, he mentioned you more than once." She had not known that. She did not say anything, because there was nothing adequate to say, and the almanac was on the table between them, and his hands were close to it, and she was aware of how close they were in a way she could not account for rationally. "What did he say?" she asked finally. Edmund looked at her. He had very dark eyes, and he used them sparingly, which meant that when he turned them directly toward her, it had a quality of weight that she was not entirely equipped to receive without noticing. That she read to him, Edmund said. That she argued with him, that she stayed. He did not say anything else, neither did she. The fire said something small and brief in the grate, and they went back to their books, and she carried the warmth of that particular silence home with her to the room above the kitchen where she slept, and it kept her awake for some time. Lady Constance Fellows moved on Halcott 2 weeks into April. She arrived with her solicitor, her daughter, and a document she called a formal objection and Edmund's solicitor called legally premature, and she took up residence in the East Wing with the authority of a woman returning to property she considers fundamentally hers and has merely been inconvenient enough not to be standing in at the relevant moment. She was not cruel in any direct or unambiguous sense. She was something more difficult than cruel, which was confidently certain, and certain in the way of people who have never had their certainty successfully refuted. She gave a dinner. The invitation was extended to the county neighbors, with a specificity that suggested she had prepared the list before she arrived. And to Edmund, who could not easily decline without signaling a conflict she would have been too happy to publicize, and to Georgiana's friend, Miss Hartley, who was pretty in an undemanding way and very willing to be guided on the subject of the Earl. It was not extended to her which was expected. What was not expected, or not precisely expected, was the moment in the withdrawing room after dinner, when Georgiana Fellows addressed the assembled guests in a voice pitched to carry to the corners. "I do confess," Georgiana said, with the smile of a young woman who has been told that a certain kind of smile is disarming, "I cannot make sense of any of it." The man was not. Toward the end in his full capacities was he. For a gentleman of his rank to leave such provision to the boot girl, there must be some explanation that does not reflect well on someone. The room received this with the particular avidity of rooms that have been waiting for permission to discuss a thing they have already been discussing. Edmund did not look at Nora. Nora was not in the room. Nora was in the kitchen, where she had taken herself because the evening had the smell of the kind of evening she was not equipped to survive by standing in it. It was Mrs. Bird, the housekeeper, who told her the next morning what Georgiana had said. Not cruelly, but efficiently, because Mrs. Bird believed that a person ought to know what was being said of her by the people who were saying it. Nora thanked her and went about her mourning. And the almanac was in her pocket, and she did not take it out because she did not want to sit with anything tender. That morning, Lady Constance's formal challenge to the will arrived in Mr. Midia Hale's offices on the 22nd of April. It cited, among other grounds, the old Duke's diminished mental state at the time of composition, the undue influence of a person in a dependent position, and the implausibility of any legitimate affection between a man of the Duke's standing and a domestic servant, which the document called, with legal precision, the named claimant, formerly employed in a menial capacity. Edmund received the document in the library. Nora knew he had received it because the library door was closed for 3 hours in the morning, which it never was. When it opened, he looked the same as he always looked, which was to say he looked like a man who had decided to look the same as he always looked, and the decision itself was visible if you knew where to search for it. He said, "This will not succeed, Miss Patten." She said, "I know." And then, because the door was open, and the corridor was empty, and she had been managing the temperature of her interior for rather long enough, "But I do not wish to be the cause of difficulty for you. The estate, the house, your relationships with the county. Lady Constance has considerable standing. If it would simplify matters for everyone concerned, I would relinquish the fortune. I am not entirely certain I was meant to have it. Your great-uncle was fond of me. I do not believe he understood entirely what he was doing to the rest of the situation." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was a line she had come to know the small adjustments of. "My great-uncle understood everything he did," he said. "He was 83 and his eyes were weak and he could not walk the grounds, but he was not in any way diminished where it mattered. He did what he intended to do." His voice did not rise. "Do not speak of relinquishing it again." She opened her mouth. Miss Patten. Her given name was still Miss Patten. It was not nothing, but it was not yet the other thing. Do not. She did not. It was the 2nd week of May, and the evening was warm enough that the windows stood open in the servants' corridor when Nora heard the 2 housemaids talking in the room below. She was not intending to listen. She was passing from the linen cupboard to the back stair. But voices carry upward in old houses, and these voices were not being lowered. "No, but what she is," said the first housemaid, whose name was Agnes, "is a woman who knew exactly which old man to attach herself to. And now the Earl has to manage it all on account of her. And he'll not find a decent match while the county thinks he harbors her. She's done for his prospects, that's what. Poor boot girl. That's all she ever was." The second housemaid said something agreeable. Nora stood very still in the corridor for the space of perhaps 10 seconds. The linen under her arm was very white and clean. The almanac was in her apron pocket. She thought about him in the library, his voice level, his jaw, its particular line, the dark eyes that gave nothing and somehow gave everything when they turned toward her. She thought about Miss Hartley, who was pretty in an undemanding way and had nothing attached to her name by the county that was not ordinary and respectable. She went to her room and began, quietly, to pack. She told herself it was the right thing. She had said she did not wish to be the cause of difficulty for him. She had meant it then, and she meant it now. The fortune, if she relinquished it, would resolve the challenge. Edmund's prospects would resolve. The county would settle. She would find a position somewhere else, somewhere that did not know her name. She had done it once at 17. She could do it again at 24. She had her hands, and she had her education, and she had 7 years of experience in the running of a great house, and she would be fine. She told herself this carefully, and fully, and her hands moved through her small possessions with the practice of hands that know what packing requires, and she did not cry, because she had decided some years ago that crying was a thing she reserved for very specific occasions, and this was not one of them. She folded the gray wool with the precision of a woman who has mended it twice, and knows exactly where the mend is. She set the 2 books she owned on top of it, and then the small tortoiseshell comb her mother had left her. And then she paused at the almanac for a long time without picking it up. She had no right to take it. She had every right to take it. He had given it to her, and the giving was not provisional, and she was not going to leave it behind for Lady Constance Fellows to find in the morning and misunderstand. She put it in the pocket of the grey wool where it lived, and she closed the bag. She was at the front door at 6:15 in the morning, her bag in hand, when she heard him on the stair. "Miss Patten." She did not turn immediately. She required a moment. When she turned, he was 3 steps from the bottom of the main staircase, and he had clearly dressed with speed, and he was looking at her with the expression she had never been able to name but had catalogued very thoroughly in the private room, where she kept the things she was not permitted to do anything about. "You are leaving," he said. "I am," she said. "I asked you not to relinquish it." "I am not relinquishing it before a solicitor," she said. "I am simply removing the difficulty. He may have it by default. Your prospects will be restored. The county will settle. You will be able to marry without complication, and Lady Constance will have no more reason to make your life difficult, on my account." He came down the last 3 steps. He crossed the entrance hall, which was very large and very quiet at that hour, the morning light coming through the tall windows and long, cold bars across the stone floor. And the crossing took him perhaps 7 strides, and he did not hurry, but he did not hesitate. Behind him the door to the morning room stood open. Mrs. Bird was in the morning room. She had been up since 5, as she always was, and she had heard the footsteps. Mr. Pryse, Hale, who had arrived the evening before to discuss the proceedings for the following morning's meeting with Lady Constance's solicitor, was in the breakfast room with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had expected to be surprised before breakfast, but not quite in this manner. Lady Constance herself, who had been descending the east wing staircase in the private manner of someone conducting reconnaissance, had stopped on the 4th step and was holding the banister with a grip that spoke less of concern for her balance than of concern for her composure. Georgiana Fellows was visible at the top of the east wing stair behind her mother, very upright. They were all in their various positions, witnesses. He stopped 2 feet from her. This was close enough that she was aware of the height of him, the warmth of him, the sound of his breathing, which was not entirely regular. "Nora," he said. It was the first time. She had known this moment was coming, or had hoped it was coming, and the knowing had not prepared her for the way her name and his voice felt like something settling into a correct position after a long maladjustment. He reached out and took the bag from her hand. He set it on the floor beside him without looking at it. "Miss Patten is my intended," he said. "The will stands as written." He said it to the entrance hall, which was to say he said it to all of them, to Mrs. Bird and to Mr. Hale and to Lady Constance, 4 steps up on the east wing stair, with her hand on the banister. He said it in the flat, certain way of a man making a procedural statement that has the force of policy and does not require anyone's agreement to be true. The silence that followed was of a variety that Nora had never experienced before, which was to say it was the silence of a great many things that had been arranged one way, for a very long time, beginning to arrange themselves another way. "Lady Constance," said Edmund. Her voice had shed several of its usual layers and sounded underneath, like a woman who had for the first time in many years encountered the limit of her particular kind of confidence. "The challenge will be withdrawn," Edmund said. "Mr. Hale will remain, and we will sign whatever is required to confirm that this morning. Lady Constance, I am grateful for your visit. I believe the East Wing will be available for your use until the end of the week." He was not cruel. He was precise. There is a distinction, and the distinction matters. Lady Constance stood on the 4th step and understood, in the public manner of a woman who has always depended on consensus, and has just watched the consensus reorganize itself, that the machinery she had been operating for the last 40 years had encountered something outside its specifications. Georgiana Fellows, at the top of the east wing stair, looked at him, and then looked at her with the particular expression, of a young woman who is very surprised but is too well raised to say so, and then looked away, which was its own kind of acknowledgment. Mrs. Bird appeared at the door of the morning room, with the expression of a woman who has been at Halcott for 30 years and has been waiting, without knowing she was waiting. For exactly this, Mr. Hale set down his coffee. She stood in the entrance hall with her bag on the floor beside her, and the almanac in her apron pocket, and the morning light coming in long bars across the stone, and she looked at him, as he looked at her, with his dark eyes and the expression she had now sufficiently catalogued to know its name. "Hiya! You did not consult me," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very pleased that it was steady. "No," he said. "You should have." "I know. I would have said yes." Something changed in his face. It was not large as these things go. It was the difference between a face that is managing itself carefully and a face that has briefly decided that management is not required. "Then we are agreed," he said, and his voice had dropped to the register she associated with the library at night, with the fire low and both of them reading. "We are agreed," she said. If you have wondered why a good man gives his fortune to a woman the world has overlooked, stay a little longer. The answer is not mystery. The answer is that he saw her, and he knew what seeing her was worth. The months that followed were not without difficulty. The formal proceedings took until midsummer. There were solicitors and signatures and 2 separate meetings that required all parties to sit in a room together and be civil, which was achieved with the particular rigidity of people who have decided to be civil and intend to remain civil for the duration and not a moment thereafter. Lady Constance, to her credit, withdrew her challenge with a legal precision that suggested she had reconsidered the mathematics of the situation and found them unfavorable. Georgiana Fellows was gone from Halkett by Thursday. The county had a great deal to say in the weeks that followed. Then, as counties do, it said it again with the air of saying it for the first time, and then gradually it became absorbed in other concerns, and then the engagement was announced in the papers, and then the concerns of the county reorganized around the announcement, rather than around the circumstances that had preceded it. Edmund had Halkett's east wing repointed in June. He had the orangery drain cleared in July. He walked the grounds with Nora in the evenings, when the summer light held long and the old Duke's 3 dogs came along. And they talked about the things they had each been thinking separately, for several months, without saying, and the talking was easier than it had any right to be. She taught him which books in the library had belonged to his great-uncle personally, and which had been inherited from the generations before, because she knew the library better than he did. He taught her the names of the tenant farmers whose leases ran through Halcott's eastern boundary, because he knew the estate better than she did. It was a practical exchange and also something else, and the something else accumulated quietly in the way of things that do not announce themselves until they are already considerable. There was an evening in July when they had walked out after supper, and the light held so long they did not notice the hour, and the old Duke's 3 dogs came between them and around them, in the loose pattern of dogs who have decided this is their arrangement and do not intend to revise it. Edmund did not take her hand. He walked close enough that the back of his hand grazed hers twice in the same passage of ground, and the second time, neither of them moved away. She was aware of the grass and the gray stone of the estate wall, and the sound of the dogs ahead in the long evening, and of his hand at her side, with the specific held quality of a hand that knows what it wants and is exercising the discipline appropriate to the occasion. The distance between that discipline and its surrender was, she had come to understand, one of the niche's particular pleasures for the person who understood it. She understood it. He proposed formally in the library, on a Tuesday evening in August with the fire lit early against an unseasonable chill. He did it without preamble, which was consistent with his general approach to declarative statements, and Nora looked at him across the reading table where the almanac sat between them, as it usually sat, because she had continued to use the library's reading table as though it were hers, and he had never suggested otherwise, and she said, which was the only answer she had ever had available on a subject, and she was glad to finally give it. She sat with the almanac in her hands after he had gone upstairs. It was small and dark green and worn at the corners, and it smelled of the old Duke's study of tobacco and ink. and something she had always thought of as the smell of a mind that had been very extensively used. She opened it to the first page where the old Duke had written his name in the careful copperplate of a man who had learned to write in the previous century. Aldous Claverfield Halcott, 1801. Below it, in the same hand, but from a different year, in ink, slightly paler with age, a single added line. To Miss Nora Patten, who stayed when she did not have to, and who made the winter mornings considerably better than they had any right to be. Well done, child. Well done. She sat with that for some time. The fire did what fires do. The dogs were asleep on the hearthrug. Outside the August dark was soft, and the first of the autumn came in through the open window on a wind that smelled of harvest and the estate's long grass. She put the almanac back in her apron pocket, where it had always lived. She was still wearing the good gray wool she had worn to the will reading in March. Or rather, she had put it on again that evening, because the nights were cooling, and it was the most comfortable thing she owned, and she did not need any more to reserve it for funerals. The morning she had dreaded had become the morning. Everything changed. The thing she had not known to want had turned out to be the thing she had been waiting for without the vocabulary to name it. This is how the best things sometimes arrive. Not announced, and not expected, but recognized the moment they appear. The way you recognize a word you have always known the meaning of, but never previously been given occasion to say aloud. She said good night to the dogs. She said good night to the fire. She went upstairs, and the house held her the way houses hold the people who have lived in them long enough to be held. Thank you for staying until the end of this one. If Nora's story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment you felt it turn. There are more stories here, and every one of them is waiting.